Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Darkest Hour. I'm your host, Amanda Jane. Imagine the moments after midnight when the world is at its quietest, yet the air is thick with secrets. What happens when the bravest among us, the firefighters, the paramedics, police, come face to face with the unknown, when their courage is tested not by the living, but by the echoes of the dead? How do you rescue a soul already lost, or protect yourself from what you can't see? Where the sirens wail and the radio crackles with static, what lurks just out of sight? Are these fleeting glimpses merely tricks of a weary mind, or something more sinister? In this place, every call could be their last, and every shadow hides a story. Tonight, we're doing a ride-along, so ask yourself, what would you do in the face of the inexplicable? What happens when the line between life and death is no longer clear? Brace yourself as we push the boundaries of fear, and where the bravest encounter the unimaginable. So, let's get started, shall we? When I was a probationary constable, I was on patrol with a senior constable in South Australia. We received a noise complaint of a party in an old derelict building on the outskirts of the city. As we approached, there was a man standing, waving us down. From the car, the noise was deafening, concert loud. This is a heritage-listed home built circa 1700s, and the windows were all covered by boards, and the lighting came through the cracks. The whole property had a 2-meter fence with barbed wire atop. As we could find no way in, the fire department called for help. 30 minutes later, with more backup to catch the possible squatters living in the house, everyone was in position to make entry. 3, 2, 1. Ground floor breached, officers yelling their presence. The house thrust into darkness, and no one was there. No one but us. 20 members of the emergency services, staring at each other. Most had confused looks. Next shift, I was informed that the house with the party was indeed over 100 years old, and had been sealed for over 40 years after a party guest was killed, and the house was deemed unsafe as the cause of death was unknown. The house was never connected to or built for electricity, yet on that night, over 20 professional people heard loud music from the 80s, and through the cracks, saw the lighting of a modern-day disco. To this day, my friends and I still don't know what it was, and we definitely don't talk about it. But thanks for letting me share. I had a paramedic supervisor back in the 90s who had 20 years in EMS, who had a reputation for being a tough guy with a big heart. He told us a story that raised the hair on the back of my neck one day that I'll never forget. In 1981, he was an EMT for a volunteer fire department in a New Hampshire farming community. In this town lived an elderly brother and sister along with an elderly cousin on a sprawling farm. They were very well liked by the townsfolk, and they would offer a plot of their farmland to anyone for asking, with one simple rule: that no matter what they grew, they had to donate 1/3 of their yield to the area's local food banks. This was just one of the reasons they were so beloved. As they got older, Mary, the sister, became frail with osteoporosis and was admitted to a nursing home. John, her brother, was left to look after the farm. One day, the cousin who lived nearby was unable to reach John by phone and became concerned. He went to the farm, entered the house. He discovered John in an upstairs bedroom, unconscious, suffering from a stroke. He immediately called 911. Word of trouble at the farm spread quickly, and soon the siren was blaring, notifying volunteers in the town. The town's police and ambulance raced to the farm. An ambulance from an adjoining community was also dispatched. My boss was one of the EMTs responding and was familiar with this family. When he arrived, he said he walked into the house and was told to hurry as CPR was underway. As he entered the front hall, on his left was a sitting room, and in the room he noticed an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair, smiling back at him. He thought how happy and peaceful she looked, and was a bit odd given what was going on. He then recognized her. It was Mary, the man's sister. They got John to the ambulance and transported him to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. As my boss was filling out his report at the nurse's station, he made a comment to one of the staff, saying how sad it was that Mary was finally well enough to go home, and then John would die like that. The staff member gave him a strange look, asked what he was talking about. My boss said how great Mary looked at the house. He was then informed that Mary passed away the day before at the nursing home and couldn't have possibly been at the farm. Thinking he mistook someone else for Mary, he asked around about who the female was at the house. There were no females during the call. All the responders were male. He then described what she was wearing, including an oversized set of pearls and a pink flowered dress. The dress was Mary's favorite. He had no doubt that the pleasant elderly woman who gave him a warm smile was indeed Mary. 2 days later, my boss and his then-girlfriend decided to attend the wake for John and Mary, a double wake and funeral, as Mary was the girlfriend's grade school teacher. As my boss walked into the funeral, he gazed over at the coffin holding Mary, and he nearly fainted. Mary was wearing her favorite pink dress with an oversized pearl necklace, exactly as she wore 2 days earlier at the farm. I responded to a call with another unit in a fairly new neighborhood. The call was sketchy and vague and classified as a disturbing the peace call. Upon arrival, the other officer and I knocked on the door, which was answered by a slightly sheepish guy in his 30s. He was well-dressed with a conservative haircut. He said he was having a problem with hearing voices in his house. Our initial feeling was that this was a normal person who was not experiencing any kind of mental breakdown. So our next step was to investigate where the voices might be coming from. His house was not connected to his neighbors' houses, and there was no obvious problems with loud radios, TVs, or outside influences. The guy was very thoughtful and open to any suggestions we made for explaining the voices, but we were stumped. We asked him if he heard the voices now, and he said no. He added that the voices were not always there, and had stopped just after he called on this occasion. He said that they started soon after he moved in, and at first assumed they were from loud neighbors. After he continued to hear them at odd hours, in times when the neighbors were not home, he became worried. As he's explaining, suddenly we hear someone talking. It sounds like they're saying, "What's going on?" I look at my partner. He heard it too. We look at the guy who's staring at us, waiting for our reaction, and then he asks, "Did you hear it?" We tell him we're pretty sure we did, so we do another sweep at the house. Still, we find nothing. He admitted that he didn't think the police could help, but he had no one else to call. After we felt that we'd investigated every source that we possibly could, we had to tell him that we couldn't help. We actually felt bad because we didn't have any solution to offer him. As the other officer and I were walking back to our cars, we just looked at each other as if to say, that was spooky. A few months later, I drove through the neighborhood and noted a sold sign on his front lawn. I guess he found a solution on his own. Working in border towns, there's a lot of highways and ranches, and at night it gets dark. I'm talking about the type of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. So one night I'm driving along the highway, and the only source of light is the one coming from my high beams, so I don't mistakenly run over any animals. About 150 meters in front of me, I see a man run across the highway and jump into the ranch. Next, I pull over to the area that I had last seen the man, and I turn on my flashlight to scan the area. While looking, all that I was thinking was it smelled horrible, like something had died. I brushed it off as normal because there's all types of wildlife and things to die. After about 5 minutes of scanning, I'd seen the man laying down with his hoodie covering his head, hiding behind some bushes. I identify myself as law enforcement and command him in English and Spanish to stand up because I see him, but he doesn't budge an inch. I get a little closer to the man, grab his shoulder, and turn him around. And that's when I jumped and gasped in disbelief because the man was deceased, very deceased. When the coroner arrived, they said the man had been dead for nearly a day or two. So there's no way that he had died when I'd seen him cross the road. This ultimately led me to believe that the man's spirit wanted me to find his body, and he did. I don't think he wanted to be unidentified or missing any longer. Very early on a winter morning, my colleague Pete and I were trying to stay inside the patrol car and out of trouble. We were halfway through a week of night shifts that had turned up a dead body on a bus, someone who had choked on their own vomit and fallen asleep on a rear bench, along with a dead body at a bail inquiry, 2 inches of dead flies up against the inside of a window, and an unaliving. We had just dealt with a 2-month-old baby left alone with 2 bottles of milk while his mother got pimped out around the corner at a rough club in Dalston. He'd been screaming since 9 p.m. That's what the neighbors said when they called at midnight. We hoofed in the door. The mother and her madam had been turned up, kicking off and demanding the kid back around 2 a.m. Pete and I had expended quite a bit of energy getting her into the cells. We go back out at the end of the witching hour, 4 a.m. Our skipper promises us the easy stuff, and we get a routine call. Woman heard screaming in the street, with a general location of a tower block not far from us. We get this call several times a night. Most times an area search reveals nothing. Sometimes it's amorous foxes or loud TV. We get this a lot with gunshots. People in tower blocks watch movies with headphones so they can turn the volume right up on an action flick. The headphone lead accidentally gets pulled out, sudden eruption of calls, shots heard. But you never know. We can guarantee at least once in your career, it will be something. In Hackney, in early 2000s, that could be a couple times a year. Well, we find the block, and its L-shaped open-air balcony landings with 3 stairwells, one at each end and another at the junction. We go up the first stairwell, 8 floors, not even the usual rough sleepers, very quiet. We look down each balcony, then across the middle. We planned for one of us to go down each remaining stairwell. A foil to our plans, the balcony had been sealed off with expensive-looking double-glazed partitions. so we had to go back down to ground level. This meant that we had to climb the last stairwell again, all 8 floors. We don't even know if this is where the child screaming was heard. There's only been one call, and all is silent. We were just about to have a discussion on whether we should call it an ASNT, area search no trace, or start climbing. Then we smelt a delicate, flowery perfume. It wouldn't have hung around long, so we start climbing. On the 4th floor, we saw blood dripping down the stairs. Calling for more units and climbing a bit more tactically. We couldn't smell the perfume anymore, but on the 5th floor, wedged upright behind an emergency panel, the body of a young lady. She'd been stabbed several times around the neck, face. A large amount of blood was slowly draining out of her skull, making its way downstairs. As our colleagues are cordoning off the building, we find the victim's purse and driver's license. She has an address on the next floor. We knock on, and eventually, a sleeping flatmate comes out, confirms the victim lives there. With the detectives questioning the flatmate, we search the girl's room and find a bottle of the exact perfume we smelled downstairs. The victim lives alone but has a Russian boyfriend who the flatmate has a bad feeling about. One of the detectives used to work at Heathrow and expedites a trace on this guy's passport. The first flight to Moscow is in about an hour. We return to the station to write up our evidence. As we're going off duty, the detectives tell us the boyfriend was kicked trying to board the first flight to Russia. Bloodied wet wipes were found in a bin near his car, with a bloodied overcoat, where he had vigorously cleaned himself before abandoning the lot in the far reaches of a car park. Pete and I attended the coroner's office for the autopsy. The coroner said that she had died almost instantly, but at least 4 hours before we had found her. We asked about the perfume, and he said no trace was found on her. So, who smelt of perfume, and who screamed less than 15 minutes before we found her? Everyone in the block passed the alibi and attitude test. No one admitted seeing her or hearing any screaming. The call came from a mobile at the night bus stand across the street. All they heard was a scream. I kept trying to tell myself that it was possible that she was wearing the perfume. We just didn't smell it after that initial moment because we were focused on the blood. But the coroner looks for stuff like that, said that she wasn't wearing any. Even then, she must have applied it when she left for work the previous morning. The bottle was still on her bedside. Still, it shouldn't have been so strong to carry down 5 flights. I guess it's also possible a rough sleeper found her, screamed, and ran. But they know if they witness something like this, it's a guaranteed couple of hot meals back at the nick and pick of the lost and found. They can get some shoes, things like that, if they help us out. I don't know. Something about this case, though. I think about that perfume a lot. Is it paranormal? I don't know. I'm not exactly sure if this is paranormal, but I did have one moment that I can only explain as non-religious awe at witnessing what the soul of a person looks like. We as EMTs and paramedics accompany death all the time. We're present as we treat people who die in the midst of treatment, and we switch to resuscitation protocols and carry on, or we arrive on scene to find people who are clinically dead and occasionally resuscitate them to being clinically alive, sometimes even to the point of consciousness and responsiveness. But I had one patient whose death impacted me in a way that changed my life. He was assaulted in the restroom of a porn theater. He was viciously sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times in the chest and abdomen, and several of his fingers were cut off to steal his rings. We weren't far from the hospital, so we scooped him up and took off. I was treating him en route, starting 2 large bore IVs, sealing up the pneumothorax, dressing the other wounds, etc., keeping up the professional babble, something like, "It's going to be okay. We're headed to the best trauma center in the area. You hold on now. Okay? You just keep breathing. Slow and deep. We've got this. You just hold on for me. You're doing great. Blah, blah." Suddenly, he grabbed my arm and said, "Please stop. I'm scared. I don't want to die alone. Just hold my hand, please." I'll never forget that. I was stunned. I stopped, sat on the bench, and held his hand. His eyes locked with mine, and as he took several agonal breaths, I watched his eyes change. 1 second, he was human, and then, inexplicably, he was not. I know that for anyone who's seen the eyes of a dead person, you can recognize them for what they were. But I've never been consciously present with a patient in that fraction of a moment when their eyes, the windows to the soul, emptied, and that person ceased to exist. It was scary and awesome, in the true sense of the word, and a sense of horror to accompany him as he left. I simply will never find the words to express that feeling. It kind of shook me because I'd gotten into this line of work after my mom died. I was never raised with religion or any kind of faith in something bigger than us. When a person died, their body decomposed, and only memories of them kept them alive. But now I wondered, was my mom somewhere out there in the ether? Did her soul still exist somewhere? When I dreamed of her, was her presence real? So that experience changed my life, made me question so much about death and life, where one begins and the other ends. Is it paranormal? I don't know. As a member of my agency's dive team, I was called upon to search an abandoned rock quarry during a missing person investigation. The victim had been reported missing by his wife, and a 6-month investigation by the detective assigned to the case had yielded no clues as to his whereabouts. After only 10 to 15 minutes of searching, I located the victim's vehicle at the bottom of a quarry, in about 35 feet of water. I was unable to determine whether or not the victim's body was in the vehicle. This was due to the roof of the vehicle being smashed and the vehicle being upside down. At this point, we marked the vehicle's location on the bottom with a buoy and called for a wrecker to winch the vehicle out of the water. Once the wrecker arrived on scene, we rigged the vehicle with cables, and the wrecker began to pull the vehicle out of the water. As soon as the air bubbles that had been trapped in the car reached the surface, we knew the victim was in the vehicle. The smell was absolutely horrid. I'd never in my life smelled something that horrible. I can only describe it as a combination of rotting human flesh, fish, and swamp. The detective on scene began to retch and dry heave. The wrecker driver lost his lunch, and a state trooper nearly passed out. It was that awful. Once we had the vehicle out of the water, we were met with a ghastly sight. The victim was still in the driver's seat with his seatbelt on. His body was bloated and had a green and black mottled appearance. The body was in terrible shape from its 6 months in the water. We were unable to pull the body out of the car because every time we tried, the skin slipped off the bone and tore off in chunks. After some serious thought, we decided to have the local rescue squad cut the roof and the doors off the vehicle to allow us better access to the body. We were finally able to get the victim into a body bag, mostly intact. I was able to decontaminate and shower on scene using the shower in our mobile command center. When I arrived home after leaving the scene, My wife immediately put her hand over her mouth and nose, exclaiming, "What is that awful smell?" So, once again, I showered and spent plenty of time scrubbing. This was definitely the worst smell I've ever encountered in 14 years as an emergency responder. It was determined that the victim had gone into the quarry to sit in his vehicle and smoke crack. Somehow he mistakenly hit the accelerator, sending the vehicle into the quarry, thus ending his life. The most heart-wrenching thing about this job, it's a look, a general appearance. It's this stillness that is unlike anything else. When you're looking at this person, it's as though this person, who's on the brink of death, has come unplugged, and they're just waiting for the final shutdown. I saw it on an old lady last week who was barely breathing. She wasn't my patient, but everyone did what they could to help. I saw it on a young mother. She'd been run over by a truck while pushing her baby across the street before being dragged by her rosary under the vehicle for about 20 feet. I can still see her eyes looking into mine, and that feeling of just knowing that she's in deep trouble. I've seen it on a lot of people, but the reaction it causes never changes. It's a realization that this person's life is hanging by a thread, and that how I treat them, how we treat them, in the next 5 to 10 minutes could make the difference between whether or not their baby grows up without a mom. It's knowing that somehow we both wound up in this situation, and it's up to me to try to make the best of it. I, along with several other people that I've worked with, have had unexplained experiences. One in particular sticks in my mind. One afternoon, we had an old couple in a nicer neighborhood die. It was a murder-suicide. The husband had terminal cancer, and the wife was bad off with dementia. He laid her down on some plastic in the living room and shot her and then himself. He left a note, but it was kind of rambling and hard to make anything out of it. Several months and a cleanup later, a young couple bought the house at a really cheap price. It had sat on the market for about 9 months, so they came in low and got the house. About 3 weeks later, the wife called in the middle of the night, saying that someone was in the house upstairs. We all show up, clear the house, and find nothing. Both parents and both children all said the same story. They saw a dark figure walk from the hallway into a room. The same thing happened every night for the rest of the week. It got to the point where the entire family wouldn't go upstairs, and the lights stayed on 24/7. Eventually, the family got tired of living in fear, so they went to stay with the family for a bit. They asked that we keep an eye on the house, which in all honesty, we'd already been doing because who wouldn't want to see a ghost, right? They gave us access to their house, permission to enter if necessary. Late one night, I was driving by, hopped out of my car to check on things when I saw someone walk by the upstairs window, and then the light in that room turned off. I called up my partner, and we made entry into the house. The feeling inside was awful. You knew something wasn't right. The air just felt depressed. Kind of like the feeling you get at a funeral home, but times 10. We searched downstairs and made sure that nobody could come in or out. We weren't real happy about going upstairs, but it was our job, so we did it. Let me tell you, upstairs felt disgusting and oppressive. Imagine how it feels when you're in a swimming pool. You try to run or move quickly through the water, but it's really restrictive, so you can't. That's the best way to describe the feeling. All of a sudden, the same room whose light I saw turn off, turned back on. Creepy. We went into the room and nothing. As a matter of fact, not a single person was in the whole house. This was years before body cameras were a thing, so a lot of us made it a common practice to carry pocket-sized digital recorders in our pockets to protect ourselves and offer as evidence should we need to. On reviewing our recording, we could hear talking that wasn't either my partner or I. Our voices were easily discernible, and the other voice definitely wasn't ours. Nor was it really loud enough or clear enough to make out what it was saying, but it was obvious that it was there. It would have been like if someone was in another room talking, and you could pick up the conversation but couldn't make out the words. Neither of us heard the talking when we were there in person. Made your hair stand on end, gave you chills to hear it. To this day, it vividly stands out in my mind, even though that was very early on in my career. I was a home health nurse for many years. When we had to see a new patient, we had a ridiculous amount of information to gather. Thankfully, the company gave us new laptops, so it wasn't so bad. This particular patient needed wound care on his foot and IV therapy. When I finally found his house, I pulled into his driveway, sat there for a few minutes. I had that feeling like someone was watching me. I sat there for a couple minutes thinking that I didn't want to go into his house, but I gathered my stuff and went to the door. My patient answered the door and let me in. It was a ranch home with an open concept kitchen, living room, and dining room. My patient was barefoot except his wound dressing. He went into the kitchen to wash his hands as I set up my computer and things at the dining table. I sat with my back to the living room. As I was starting up my laptop, I heard someone in heavy shoes walk down the hallway across the hardwood floors from the bedroom and then stop behind me. I had the feeling that they were standing directly behind me. I turned around to introduce myself, but no one was there. I turned around the other way and still saw no one. I looked around to see if there was a doorway that I hadn't seen. I started to feel like, what the fuck? I know someone was there. I could feel it. My patient was watching me and chuckling. He said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Oh, nothing. I thought I heard someone walk up behind me." He still had a grin on his face and he asked me, "Are you a sensitive?" I said, "Well, kind of. Why?" He said, "Do ghosts bother you? If they do, you don't have to do this." I politely said, "No, I'm okay. Why?" All the while, my patient is still grinning. He said, "We have a ghost. You don't have to be scared. He's friendly, but he does like to screw with people." He also was into computers, so he might be wanting to see what you're doing. He's kind of protective, but I think he'll be okay with you. He's a friend of mine. I rented this place off of him and his wife. He was into construction and was always over here fixing things and hanging out with me. We had a problem with the roof. He was up there 2 years ago fixing it. He'd been up and down ladders all of his life. We don't know what happened, but he lost his balance, getting off the roof onto the ladder, and fell headfirst onto the driveway. We called 911 and did what we could. They life-flighted him, but they said he was gone when they landed. They kept him on life support until family came into town. I don't think he knows he's dead because he never left. He's still here. We hear him walking around on the roof, in the basement, or in the house. Things move. Tools go missing. He had his heavy work boots on. You can hear him walking real easy. He always said that he wanted to die with his boots on. and he did. While he was talking, I had the strongest feeling of someone in my face, like looking over my shoulder at my computer. I told him this, and he said he was probably just wanting to check out the laptop, see what I was doing. I shrugged my shoulders and said, "Okay, well, let's do this." I was kind of intrigued, so I figured that I would just treat him like any other family member. I could feel him next to me, so strongly. I turned to where I could feel him and introduced myself, explained my laptop, and what I was going to do. As soon as I turned my attention to my patient, it felt like someone kicked my chair on the leg, so hard that it shifted a few inches. My patient laughed and said, "I told you he screws with people." This continued through the whole visit. I never felt threatened during this, but it's not something I wanted to do again. That was the last time I saw that patient. Well, friends, it appears we've reached the end of tonight's episode. Thanks for joining me. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world over here. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night. Keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos, and of course, double features. Subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Big thanks to those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to all of my patrons, whom we appreciate so very much. Tracy S, Tamara K, Monica L, ZoeWatt, Chelle B, Donald C, The Dark Cosmos, Marion T, Rat Girl, Alisha S, Erin G, Nikki H, Mr. Revenant, Naz K, Brendon G, Paul T, Nicholas C, Lissane, Arlene F, Adrienne, and TF Parham. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Do you have stories like these? I'd love to share them. Send them to me, amandadarkesthour@gmail.com, or on the Darkest Hour subreddit, The Darkest Hour, YT. Stay spooky.